Wade Coleman had not spoken a kind word to any woman in 7 years, and the whole of Millbrook County, Montana territory knew better than to expect he ever would again. That was the reputation that followed him like a shadow across dry summer grass, taller than the man himself, darker than his moods, and twice as stubborn. In 1883, when a man owned 2,200 acres of prime grazing land along the Yellowstone River and ran a cattle operation that supplied beef all the way to the rail depot in Bozeman, people generally left him alone when he wanted to be left alone. And Wade Coleman always wanted to be left alone. He was 33 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that years of physical work makes a man lean, with dark hair that curled at the back of his neck because he never got around to a proper barber, and gray eyes so pale they looked almost silver in certain light. He was not, by any stretch of the Montana Territory's imagination, an ugly man. That was part of what made his determined solitude so maddening to the women of Millbrook and the surrounding settlements. He had the look of someone who ought to have a family by now, someone who ought to have a wife waiting at a kitchen window with lamplight behind her, small boots drying on a porch step. Instead, he had 3 ranch hands, a cook named Otis, who was missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a threshing accident, a cattle dog named Rex, who slept at the foot of his bed, and roughly 1,300 head of longhorn cattle spread across the rolling grasslands of the Bar C Ranch. The story people told in town, the story that got retold over beans and coffee across the counters of Millbrook's 2 general stores, was that Wade Coleman had been engaged once to a woman named Evelyn, who came from Chicago and found the territory too wild, too empty, and too far from everything she had known. She had taken the eastbound stage in the spring of 1876 and never looked back. Wade Coleman had watched that stage roll away from the depot, ridden home in silence, and had not, in the 7 years since, shown the slightest interest in replacing what he had lost. Whether the loss had broken him or simply confirmed something he already suspected about himself was a matter of considerable speculation in Millbrook. The general consensus, delivered with the authority of people who had known him since he was a boy, riding behind his father on a quarter horse, was that Wade Coleman had decided love was not worth the trouble, and he had decided it in a way that was absolute and final, the way a man decides after a hard winter that he is moving somewhere with a milder climate. So the whole territory knew he would never marry. It was almost a point of local pride, the way certain landmarks become points of pride. Millbrook had a man who had made peace with solitude, and people thought there was something almost noble in it, even as they quietly hoped someone would come along and prove them wrong. That someone arrived on a Wednesday morning in late April of 1883, and she arrived arguing. Josie Hartwell, called Josie by nearly everyone who knew her, was 27 years old and had been running the Hartwell spread, 1,100 acres of good grazing land bordering the southeastern edge of the Bar C, for 3 years. Ever since her father, Samuel Hartwell, had died of a lung sickness that came on fast in the fall and simply did not let go. Her mother had passed when Josie was 10, and she had grown up working the land alongside her father and their 2 ranch hands. A quietly capable young man named Duke and an older weathered cowboy everyone called Pete, whose real name was Peter Callahan, and who had been with the Hartwell family since before Josie was born. She was not what people expected when they heard the name Hartwell. It sounded gentle, almost domestic, suggestive of flowered curtains and fresh bread. Josie was 5 feet 5 inches of concentrated determination, with dark red hair she kept braided over one shoulder when she was working, and loose around her shoulders when she rode into town. Brown eyes that missed nothing. A way of holding her jaw that suggested she had made up her mind about something and was simply waiting for the world to catch up with her decision. She wore men's work trousers most days, which was a source of gossip in Millbrook that she ignored with the same efficient indifference she applied to most gossip. She could rope and brand as well as any cowboy in the county, kept meticulous ledgers in a hand so clear it looked printed, and had once talked down a dispute at the land office in Bozeman that threatened to cost her family 200 acres, using nothing but legal citations she had spent 3 weeks reading in the public library there. The specific problem that drove her onto Wade Coleman's land on that Wednesday morning in late April, had to do with cattle. Specifically, a section of fence along the shared boundary between the Hartwell spread and the Bar C that had been poorly maintained for the better part of 2 seasons. The fence had originally been the responsibility of the Bar C under an old agreement her father had made with Wade's father, Elias Coleman, before Elias died of a bad heart in 1879 and left everything to his son. The agreement had never been written down, which was the sort of thing that happened between neighboring ranchers who trusted each other, and which caused considerable trouble when one of them died and left the arrangement in the hands of someone with no memory of it, and possibly no inclination to honor it. Wade's cattle had been drifting through the breaks in that fence for weeks. They had grazed off a section of Josie's eastern pasture that she had been saving for her own herd's spring grazing, and 2 of Wade's bulls had gotten in with her cows during a stretch when she had not wanted any breeding yet, which was going to create complications she would spend the next several months untangling. She had sent a letter. She had sent 2 letters. She had asked Pete to ride over and speak to one of Wade's hands. The fence had not been repaired. Her pasture had not been compensated for. Nothing had happened. So, on a Wednesday morning in late April of 1883, Josie Hartwell saddled her bay mare Clover, told Duke she would be back by noon, and rode north to settle the matter herself. Wade Coleman was in the near pasture when she came over the ridge, working alongside his hand Roy to check a section of his own northern fence, which, she noted with some satisfaction, appeared to be in excellent repair. He was in shirt sleeves despite the morning chill, a canvas vest over his shirt, his hat pushed back at an angle that suggested he had shoved it there in frustration and forgotten to straighten it. He turned at the sound of hoofbeats, and she watched his expression move through several things in quick succession. Surprise, recognition, then something that settled into a closed, guarded look she suspected was his default setting. She brought Clover to a stop 10 feet from where he stood. "Mr. Coleman," she said. "Miss Hartwell." His voice was low and controlled. A good voice, she noticed involuntarily, the kind that did not waste itself on extra words. "I sent you 2 letters about the fence on the south boundary," she said. "The section between my eastern pasture and your west range. I received them." "And yet the fence hasn't been repaired." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I've had my hands busy with spring work." "So have I," Josie said, her own voice perfectly even, which took some effort because she had been simmering about this for 3 weeks, and the sight of that perfectly repaired northern fence had pushed the simmer toward a boil. "I've been busy too, Mr. Coleman, but while I've been busy, 2 of your bulls have been visiting my herd without invitation, and your cattle have grazed off the better part of 30 acres I was saving for my own spring rotation." Wade looked at her steadily. There was something measuring in that look. Not unfriendly exactly, but assessing, the way a man looks at a problem he is trying to calculate the full size of. "I'll have Roy ride out and look at it this week," he said. "You'll have it repaired this week?" Josie said. "Not looked at. Repaired." A very slight pause. Roy behind him found something extremely interesting about the fence post he was examining. "And the grazing," Josie continued, because she had made a list of what she intended to say, and she intended to say all of it. "I'm not asking for a cash settlement, but I'd appreciate the use of your North Meadow for 2 weeks in June to give my eastern pasture time to recover. Your North Meadow borders the river, and you've been leaving it mostly unused for summer. I checked." Something shifted in Wade's expression. Not quite amusement. More like the moment before amusement, when a person is deciding whether the situation has earned it. "You checked?" I asked around, Josie said. "I'm practical, Mr. Coleman. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. I'm asking for what's fair." He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable, and Josie kept her chin level and met those pale gray eyes and did not look away. "All right," Wade said finally. She had expected more argument. The word caught her slightly off guard. "All right," she repeated. "I'll have the fence repaired by end of week. You can use the north meadow in June." He paused. "And I apologize for the bulls." It was such an unexpected thing. That last sentence so plain and undefended a genuine apology, delivered without decoration, that Josie felt something she had not anticipated feeling. A sudden unexpected softening somewhere in the vicinity of her chest. "Thank you," she said. And because she was honest, and because it seemed right, she added, "I'm sorry for coming over without more notice. I'm not by nature someone who enjoys a confrontation." "You're good at it, though," Wade said. And there it was, a brief, contained thing, but unmistakably a smile. She rode home with the sensation of that almost smile following her across the ridge, and made a point of not thinking about it. The fence was repaired by Friday. She found out because Pete rode out to check and came back to report that a full crew from the Bar C had been working on the south boundary since Thursday morning and had replaced nearly 200 yards of fencing with new posts and fresh wire, considerably more than the minimum required. He told her this with a slightly speculative expression she did not invite him to elaborate on. 2 days later, Wade Coleman rode over himself. He came alone, which was notable, and he came in the early afternoon when the sun was high and the light was flat and bright across the spring grass. Josie was in the small kitchen garden behind the house, turning earth for planting, when she heard the horse, and came around the side of the house to find him sitting on a gray stallion that moved with the collected, easy quality of an extremely well-trained animal. "I wanted to check the fence looks satisfactory," he said. "Pete already told me it was fine," Josie said. "More than fine. You put in a new post the whole length." "Old ones were rotted," Wade said. "Didn't see the point in doing it halfway." She was holding a garden fork, aware that she had dirt on her hands and probably on her face, and she noticed his eyes move briefly to the dirt on her hands and then back to her face with a careful neutrality that somehow made her more aware of it. "I appreciate it," she said. He did not immediately leave, which surprised her. He sat his horse and looked at the property around him, and she watched him do it. Watched him take in the house, small but solid, the barn, the kitchen garden, the corral where her 2 roping horses stood in the sun. "You've kept the place up well," he said. It was not a question, but it had the quality of something he meant sincerely. "Father built it to last," Josie said. "I just maintain what he built." "Your father was a good man," Wade said. He said it simply, the way people say things that are true. "My father respected him." "Your father was a good man, too," Josie said. "I was sorry to hear when he passed." Another of those pauses. But this one was a different kind, less guarded, more reflective. "You were alone here when your father died," Wade said. "I remember that was a hard winter. I should have ridden over." "You didn't know we needed anything," Josie said. "And I didn't ask." "You wouldn't," he said. And again there was that quality in his voice, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. Recognition. He rode away after that, and Josie stood in her kitchen garden with her dirty hands and watched the gray stallion carry him back over the northern ridge. And she thought carefully, with the kind of deliberate attention she gave to problems that needed solving, that Wade Coleman was not what she had expected. She had expected difficult. Cold and dismissive, the man the stories described, the man who had decided people were not worth his time. Instead, she had found someone reserved, certainly guarded in a way that was clearly practiced, but underneath that guardedness, she had glimpsed something essentially decent, essentially fair. The kind of man who replaces 200 yards of fence when he could have replaced 30 and called it done. She went back to her gardening and told herself firmly that this was simply the resolution of a practical matter between neighbors, and that she would think no more about it. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. The next occasion that brought them together was the spring gathering at the Doyle place, which happened every year in early May, and served as the social event most of the ranching community within 20 miles used to conduct the informal business of water rights discussions about the upcoming cattle drive to Bozeman and news from the territorial capital. The Doyle Ranch was the largest in the county, owned by a broad-shouldered patriarch named Robert Doyle, who had 3 sons and a wife named Margaret, who organized the gathering every spring with the efficiency of someone running a military campaign. Josie went every year, mostly for practical reasons. She needed to coordinate with other ranchers about the drive schedule, and there were always useful conversations to be had about market prices and trail conditions. She wore her good blue dress, the one with white buttons she had bought in Bozeman 2 years before, reserved for occasions where she needed to look like she belonged in a room. Wade Coleman was there, standing near the fence that bordered the Doyles' main paddock, a cup of something in his hand, looking like a man who had come because social obligation required it and was quietly enduring the experience. He was not talking to anyone when she arrived, which she noticed immediately, and which seemed consistent with everything she knew about him. She was pulled into conversation almost immediately by Margaret Doyle, who wanted to discuss the drive schedule, and also, Josie suspected, to assess her feelings about the situation with the fence, which had apparently been discussed in Millbrook as an interesting development between the 2 neighboring ranches. Margaret had the gift of making social intelligence gathering feel like genuine interest, and Josie responded to her questions with the careful brevity of someone who knows they are providing material for later retelling. Across the yard, she was aware of Wade watching her. Not obviously, nothing so unsubtle as staring, but in the way you become aware of a direction from which attention is coming, the way you notice heat or light shifting toward you. She made herself focus on Margaret and did not look over. "You should talk to Wade about the North Water crossing," Margaret said at one point with a casualness just slightly too carefully deployed. "He uses the same crossing for his cattle, and the 2 herds going through at the same time make a mess of the riverbank. You'll want to coordinate." "I'll keep that in mind," Josie said. "He's right over there," Margaret said, as if Josie had not noticed. Josie excused herself, with a grace she had developed specifically for situations like this, and crossed the yard toward the food table, which happened to be in the same general direction as the paddock fence. She loaded a small plate with cold biscuits and dried apple slices, turned, and found Wade Coleman standing 2 feet away. "Margaret told you to talk to me," he said straight-faced. "About the water crossing," Josie said, and felt a startled laugh nearly escape her. "She's been trying to get me to have a conversation with every unattached woman in the county since 1880, Wade said with a resignation that was somehow both weary and mildly entertained. "I apologize on her behalf. She means well," Josie said. "She does," he agreed. He looked at her with those silver-gray eyes in the full afternoon light and said, "But the water crossing is actually a real issue. I've been meaning to bring it up." So they stood by the food table and talked about the water crossing, and then about the drive schedule, and then, because these things have a way of following their own direction, about the spring grass conditions, the price of beef at the Bozeman Depot, and whether the new land assessor who had come to Millbrook the previous fall was as competent as the one before him. Wade Coleman, she was discovering, had opinions about things. Considered informed opinions, delivered with an economy of words that she found increasingly interesting, because every word he chose appeared to have been selected, rather than simply produced. He was 33, and she was 27, and they were standing in the spring afternoon light at Robert Doyle's annual gathering, talking about cattle prices, and Josie was acutely aware that several people were watching them from various comfortable distances, and that this would be discussed extensively in Millbrook by the following Tuesday. "I'm going to ride north to look at the crossing next week," Wade said. "If you wanted to come out and see the situation for yourself, it would make the coordination easier." She looked at him. He was looking at the middle distance, not at her, in a way she was beginning to recognize as his manner of making a suggestion he felt mildly uncertain about. "Wednesday would work," she said. He nodded. Wednesday, and that, as she told herself on the ride home in the golden late afternoon light, was simply a practical arrangement between two ranchers with a shared infrastructure problem. Purely practical. She did not entirely believe herself. Wednesday came with a sky like polished silver and a wind from the north that smelled of snowmelt and wild sage. Josie tied Clover to a cottonwood on her side of the crossing and was watching the river level when she heard Wade's gray stallion come down through the willows on the opposite bank. He crossed with easy confidence, the gray picking its way over the submerged stones, and came up out of the water onto the bank beside her, his boots wet to the ankle, which he appeared not to notice. "It's higher than usual," he said, looking at the river. "Late snowmelt this year. The crossing bank on my side is showing erosion," Josie said, pointing downstream about 10 yards, where the bank had cut back what she estimated was 2 feet since the previous fall. "If that continues through another high water season, I'll lose bank access entirely." Wade crouched at the bank edge and looked at the erosion cut. He had good hands, she noticed, wide across the palm, capable with a working man's roughness. He picked up a handful of soil, looked at it, and set it down. "Needs rip-wrapping," he said. "Stone packed along the bank face slows the erosion." "I know what rip-wrapping is," she said pleasantly. He looked up at her, and she saw the corner of his mouth move. "I didn't doubt it," he said. He stood. "I've got flat stone on my west slope from a wall I pulled down last fall. Probably 3 wagon loads worth, more than enough for this." "What would you want for it?" He seemed to consider this, looking at the river again. "Nothing," he said. "The bank is shared. Your erosion problem becomes my erosion problem eventually. It's in my interest to fix it." "That's a very practical way to look at it," Josie said. "Most things are clearer when you're practical," he said. And there was something in his voice that was more than the words themselves, some added weight that made her look at him more carefully. He was looking at the river, not at her, but his jaw had the set of someone who had said something that ventured slightly further than intended. They walked the bank together after that, upstream and down, assessing the whole length of the crossing approach. And as they walked, they talked about the river, the land, the particular quality of this stretch of the Yellowstone that made it beautiful and occasionally difficult. He knew the history of the river along here with the intimacy of someone who had grown up beside it, and she knew the land from her side with equal depth. The conversation moved back and forth between them with an ease that surprised her. He told her about a June flood in 1877 that had taken out the original crossing entirely. She told him about the summer her father had diverted a small channel to feed the kitchen garden. They talked about the way water moves through landscape, the way people who love land talk about it, with a seriousness and attention that people who don't understand land often mistake for eccentricity. At some point in the middle of all this, she realized the sky had shifted from silver to blue, that they had been walking for 2 hours, and that Wade Coleman was walking beside her with his hands in his pockets, his hat tilted at that slightly frustrated angle, telling her about the time his father's prize bull had gotten stuck in the river mud and required 6 men and a team of oxen to extract. He told it with a dry, contained humor that made it clear he found the memory genuinely funny, while also finding it somewhat beneath his dignity to admit how funny he found it. She laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, surprised out of her. She put her hand over her mouth and watched his face change. He was looking at her with something in his expression she could not quite name, but that made her heart do a thing she had not given it permission to do. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. His voice was quiet. "I haven't made anyone laugh in a while. I've forgotten it was a pleasant thing." She lowered her hand from her mouth and looked at him in the silver-blue Montana morning and felt the territory shift slightly under her feet. They agreed on a date in early May to bring the stone over. He helped her back onto Clover with a hand that was brief and impersonal, but which she was aware of for the rest of the ride home. And she did not spend that ride telling herself this was merely practical. She spent it being honest with herself, which was something she was usually better at. The rip-wrapping project took 3 days. Wade brought 2 wagon loads of flat stone, and all 3 of his hands, and Josie's Duke and Pete worked alongside them. The 6 of them worked steadily through the warm May days, packing stone along the bank face, and Wade worked with his men, rather than merely directing them, which she respected. A man who would dirty his hands at work he could have assigned to others was a man with a certain kind of character. In the evenings of those 3 days, as the light went long and golden, and the shadows stretched across the river grass, Wade stayed later than the work strictly required. He stayed and talked with her, the conversations finding their own rhythm, moving between the immediate and practical, and the larger and more reflective, with the ease of people who have discovered they think in compatible ways. On the second evening, he told her about his father. Not the bare facts, but the texture of him. The way Elias Coleman had been methodical to the point of stubbornness. The way he had kept a journal every day of his adult life. The way he had believed that land was not owned, but held in trust for the generations that would come after. Josie listened and recognized in what he described something of her own father. The same quality of devotion to the land as a calling rather than merely a business. On the third evening, as the last of the light went pink and orange above the western hills, she told him about her father's death, which was not something she talked about easily or often. The autumn of 1880. How quickly the lung sickness had moved, how she had been alone here on the land when it ended, just her and Pete and Duke. How she had stood in the yard the morning after he died and looked at the sky and understood with a clarity she had not expected that this land was now entirely her responsibility, that there was no one else to carry it. Wade listened without interrupting, which was its own form of generosity. And when she finished, he was quiet a moment and then said, "You carried it well." It was 4 words, and it was one of the kindest things anyone had said to her in 3 years. And she had to look away toward the river for a moment before she trusted her expression. "Thank you," she said when she turned back. He was looking at her with those pale gray eyes, and for a moment, a held, suspended moment, with the pink sky behind him and the sound of the river in the near quiet, something was very clear and very present between them. Then his hands shifted in his pockets, and he looked at the river. "I'll send Roy back tomorrow to finish packing the upper section," he said, and his voice was normal, measured, the practical voice. "I'll have Pete meet him," she said, her own voice equally measured. He rode home, and she stood on the bank and listened to the sound of his horse fade into the twilight and thought with some wonder and some apprehension that she was in considerable trouble. The month of May moved through its latter half and into early June with the territory in full bloom. The grass green and thick along the river bottoms, the hills golden at their tops where the new growth had not reached yet. The sky, that infinite Montana blue that looks invented until you live under it and understand it is the most real thing in the world. Josie began using Wade's North Meadow for her herd, as they had agreed, which brought her onto his land regularly and created an elaborate social choreography between 2 people who were very aware of each other and very careful not to let that awareness become anything they would have to directly address. Wade rode over to check the meadow situation roughly 3 times in the first 2 weeks of June. Each time it was legitimate. He was also assessing the meadow's grass condition for his own planning, and each time he stopped and talked with her for much longer than the assessment required. They both pretended this was normal, and neither said anything about it. The hands noticed. Pete in particular had the expression of someone who could say a great deal on a subject, but had decided the entertainment value of watching the situation develop was worth maintaining his silence. In the second week of June, a problem arose. A man named Harlan Briggs, who owned a mid-size ranch north of Millbrook and had been purchasing cattle from Josie's herd for 2 years, sent word he was not renewing their agreement and was instead making a deal with a larger supplier out of the Musselshell country. This was his legal right, and she could not argue it, but it removed a significant portion of her projected summer income, at a time when she had been counting on it to purchase new breeding stock. She was working through the ledger figures at the kitchen table, the lamp burning low because she had been at it since early evening, and it was now late, when she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Wade Coleman standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, which was immediately alarming because men did not ride over at 9 in the evening to deliver good news. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing happened," he said. "I heard in town today that Briggs pulled out of your agreement. I wanted to come by." She looked at him a moment. He was standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, the night behind him, the lamplight in front of him. His expression, the careful, guarded one, but with something else underneath it that she was learning to read. "Come in," she said, and stepped back from the door. He came in, and she showed him the ledger, and he looked at it with the attention of someone who understood numbers and what they meant in terms of land and cattle and survival. He sat across the kitchen table from her, and they went through the figures together, and he had a way of looking at a problem that was methodical and patient, working from what was fixed toward what was variable, finding the spaces where adjustments were possible. "Bozeman Depot is paying 20% over last year's price," he said. "If you consolidate your drive with mine in September, I can get you a combined rate on the transport that effectively closes most of this gap." She looked at the figures he had drawn quickly in the margins of her ledger. He had done the arithmetic in his head as he talked, and she checked it and found it correct. "That's not your obligation," she said. "It's a good business arrangement for both of us," he said. "Shared transport costs. Better rate, neither of us loses." "Wait," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. The lamplight moved slightly in a draft from somewhere. He looked at her across the table. "I appreciate what you're doing," she said, "and I accept it, but I want you to know that I see what it is beyond the business arrangement." Something moved in his face that was careful and guarded, and also, underneath both of those things, undefended. "What is it?" he said. His voice was quiet. "It's kindness," she said, "and I'm not used to receiving it from someone I haven't known all my life, but I find I'm grateful for it." The silence that followed was long and full. The lamp burned steadily. "I should have ridden over sooner," Wade said finally. "When your father died, I should have." "You didn't know me then," she said. "Not the way you do now." "No," he said. "I didn't know you then." The look in his eyes was something she would remember exactly. The precise quality and color of it. Silver gray in the lamplight, direct and unguarded in a way she suspected was rare for him. Rare enough to be something she understood as significant. He left half an hour later and rode home in the Montana dark. And Josie sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and the ledger open, and felt the particular complicated warmth of knowing that something had moved. Like the slow turn of a river taking a new direction. Inevitable once it begins. The summer continued in this way through June and into July. Through the long bright days and the warm brief nights. Through the shared water crossing and the coordinated grazing and the practical necessities of neighboring ranches. Around all of these practical necessities, the thing between them grew steadily, the way genuine things grow, not in rushes and declarations, but in accumulation. The slow addition of one day to another, one conversation to the next. He rode over more than the practical business required. She rode over to the North Meadow more than the grazing rotation strictly demanded. They met at the crossing frequently enough that it began to seem less like coincidence and more like the keeping of an unspoken appointment. There was that summer one further complication, and it was not of their making. A land speculator named Cyrus Vance had come through Millbrook County in early July, buying up water rights and small parcels wherever he found an owner willing to sell, with an eye, people said, toward controlling access to the Yellowstone crossings and charging every rancher in the valley for the privilege of using water that had always been shared freely. He approached Josie first, offering a price for the northeast corner of the Hartwell spread, the corner nearest the river that was generous enough to be tempting to a woman who had just lost a major buyer. She turned him down without much deliberation. She approached Wade next with the same offer applied to Bar C land, and Wade turned him down flatly, and according to Otis, who witnessed the conversation from the porch, used language he did not typically permit himself. Vance did not trouble either of them again. But the incident had the odd effect of making both of them acutely aware of how much they had already come to think of the two properties as a single piece of country worth protecting together, rather than two separate holdings that happened to share a fence line. In the third week of July, she was on the North Meadow in the late afternoon, watching her cattle settle in for the evening, when Wade rode up from the river direction. He dismounted, and they walked along the meadow edge together in the long evening light, and at some point he reached out and touched her hand, lightly, briefly, and she turned and looked at him. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask it," she said. He was looking at his boots for a moment, then the meadow, then her, and for a man who was generally so composed, he looked remarkably uncertain. "Would you come to dinner on Sunday?" he said. "At the house. Otis will cook." She felt the warmth of it move through her all the way to her hands. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." Otis's cooking turned out to be excellent, which Wade had warned her about, with the characteristic dry delivery she had come to wait for and enjoy. "He's missing 2 fingers, but they weren't the ones he needed," he said with a perfectly straight face that broke on the last word into that contained, brief smile. The Bar C house was large and masculine in the way of a house built for a family and then occupied by one man. Good furniture, comfortable rooms, the general atmosphere of a place that had decided against pretension, but had not descended into neglect. There were books on shelves. Actual books, which she noticed with pleasure, and she asked about them, and he told her about them, and they spent half an hour before dinner standing in the main room talking about books in a way that opened something between them wider than any conversation about cattle and water crossings had. He had read widely: history, natural philosophy, fiction, of the kind that took the measure of human nature. She had read with a similar appetite constrained by the limited availability of books in the territory, but compensated for by the depth of attention she gave to what she found. They discovered mutual admiration for Mark Twain and a gentle disagreement about Nathaniel Hawthorne, and the discovery of that disagreement was, she thought afterward, one of the most purely pleasurable conversations she had had in years. After dinner, Otis's beef roast with root vegetables and cornbread light and perfectly seasoned, they sat on the porch in the blue summer evening and watched the sky go dark above the hills, and Wade told her about the land. The history of the Bar C, his father's dream for it, his own sense of what he wanted it to become. He spoke with a love for this land that was unguarded and entirely real, and she understood it with her whole self, because she felt the same way about her own 1,000 acres. "What did you want for it?" she asked. "Before, when you were young. Did you imagine it the way it is now?" He was quiet a moment, looking at the dark hills. "I imagined it with more people in it," he said, his voice careful. She looked at him in the dark. "What happened to change that?" He breathed out slowly. "I imagine you've heard something of it," he said. "This county doesn't have many secrets." "I've heard something," she said, "but I'd rather hear your version." He told her about Evelyn. Not bitterly, not self-pityingly, but with the even honesty of someone who has had 7 years to understand and has arrived at a clear view of it. Evelyn had been beautiful and uncertain, he said. She had come to Montana to marry him and discovered over the course of an engagement year that she had committed herself to a life she did not want in a country that frightened her, with a man who loved the land more than she had bargained for. "I don't blame her," Wade said. "She was honest with me in the end. She told me this was not a life she could live. He stopped, looked at the dark hills. "I mistook her leaving for something about me, some quality I lacked. And I decided that the answer was to stop wanting something I'd clearly be unable to have." "Wade," Josie said. "I know," he said. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like a man who was hurt and made the wrong conclusion," she said. "That's all." "It doesn't sound like anything else," He turned to look at her on the porch, the last of the evening light behind her, the lamplight from the window in front of her, and she could see his face clearly. "You are not at all what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "I didn't expect anything," he said. "That's the point. I had stopped expecting things." She looked at him. "And now?" He reached out and very carefully, very gently, took her hand where it rested on the arm of the porch chair. His hand was warm and certain around hers, and he held it with a care that was itself a kind of declaration. "Now," he said, "I find that I am expecting things again." The night was warm, and the stars were blazing in the Montana sky above them, and the land stretched away in every direction. Her land, and his land, and the river between them, and the grass that ran to the horizon. She felt the solidity of the world under the porch boards and in the warm certainty of his hand around hers, and something that had been braced inside her for a very long time, waiting, without knowing it was waiting, released with a quiet and profound ease. "I'm glad," she said. She rode home in the dark, and she knew with the clear-eyed, practical certainty that was her nature that she was in love with Wade Coleman, and that she had been moving in that direction since the Wednesday morning she had ridden onto his land to argue about cattle. The thing that happened in August was not something either of them had planned for, but, in retrospect, it may have been the last thing needed to shake Wade Coleman entirely loose from the last of his old guardedness. It was a riding accident, not hers, his. He was working his East Range alone on a Tuesday in the second week of August, pushing cattle back from a brushy draw they had gotten themselves into, when his gray stallion stepped into a chuck hole hidden in the long grass and went down. Wade was thrown clear, which was the fortunate part, but he came down wrong on his right shoulder and was on the ground 30 yards from his horse and half a mile from the nearest hand when Josie came over the ridge on her way to check the water crossing. She saw the horse standing loose in the meadow, and then she saw the figure on the ground, and her heart turned over entirely before she could stop it. She put Clover into a gallop and was off the horse and on her knees beside him in the long grass before she had properly finished forming a thought. "I'm fine," Wade said from the ground. He was pale, holding his shoulder with his good hand. "You are not fine," she said with a firmness that came from somewhere beyond calm. "How long have you been here?" "Not long." He tried to sit up, made a sound that was not quite a word and was clearly involuntary, and stopped moving. "Stop trying to prove something," she said, and put her hands on him, carefully assessing. Not maternal, not fussing, but skilled. Moving along his shoulder and arm with the kind of competent attention she had applied to injured horses and ranch hands, and once to Pete when he had dislocated his arm pulling a stuck calf. The shoulder was not dislocated. She was almost certain it was not broken, but it was badly injured, and he needed to be off the ground and out of the August heat. "Can you get on Clover if I help you?" she said. "I can ride my own horse," Wade said. "Your horse is standing over there looking traumatized," she said. "We'll come back for him." "Can you get on Clover?" He could, with her help, and she could feel how much it cost him to accept that help. Not the physical pain, considerable as it was, but the other thing. The man's pride of it. The admission of needing assistance. She rode with him to the bar C, one hand on the reins, her other arm steadying him, and he did not protest after the first minute, which told her the shoulder was hurting more than he was admitting. Otis met them at the house with the startled expression of a man who had not expected to see his employer come home, held onto a horse by his neighbor, and went quickly for cold water and bandaging, while Josie helped Wade into the house and onto the good chair in the main room. She wrapped his shoulder with the methodical competence of someone who had dealt with injuries in the absence of a doctor, because the doctor in Millbrook was 14 miles away, and Wade was here and needed help now. She had him in a proper sling within 20 minutes and had made Otis understand what signs would require an immediate ride to fetch Dr. Foster from town. Wade sat in the good chair with his shoulder wrapped, his face still carrying the pallor of someone who had landed hard on unforgiving ground, and he looked at her with an expression completely unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before. "Thank you," he said. It was the same shape of words he had said before, but a different weight entirely. "You would have done the same," she said. "I would have," he said. "But it's not about that." She sat across from him, perched on the edge of the other chair, still slightly electrified with the aftermath of the fear that had moved through her when she had seen him on the ground in the long grass. "Wade," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "I know," he said. He was looking at her directly. "Tell me anyway," she said. "I'd rather hear it clearly." He looked at her a long moment, this careful man who had spent 7 years building walls against exactly this, and she watched him make the decision, watched him choose the open road over the closed one. "I love you," he said simply, directly, with no decoration. "I have been falling in love with you since the morning you rode onto my land and told me to repair my fence. And I have been stubbornly refusing to admit it, because admitting it meant wanting something again, and wanting something is a risk I had decided not to take." He paused. "I was wrong to decide that, and I am not wrong about what I feel." The room was warm. The afternoon light came through the windows and lay in long yellow bars across the wooden floor, and the sound of the ranch outside was the sound of summer cattle. Distant wind in the cottonwoods. Josie looked at this man she had been watching and listening to and falling in love with since April, this closed and careful and entirely good man, and felt something move through her that was as large as the Montana sky. "I love you too," she said, and it came out with the steady certainty of something that had been true long enough to be settled. "I've been trying not to because it seemed complicated and because I'm a practical woman and love seemed like something to be careful about. But there it is." He exhaled a long, slow breath like a man setting down something heavy. "Complicated doesn't frighten you," he said, and she heard the question inside the statement. "Not particularly," she said. He reached out with his good hand, and she took it, and they sat together in the afternoon light. His shoulder bandaged her hands around his, and the whole future spread before them as large and possible as the territory itself. They did not rush what came next. That was consistent with both their natures. In September, they drove their cattle together to Bozeman as planned, and the combined drive was a considerable logistical operation that required careful coordination and produced, in the doing of it, 7 days of riding and working alongside each other through the weather and the dust and the particular pleasures and difficulties of a cattle drive, which has a way of revealing character with an efficiency that years of ordinary acquaintance cannot match. Wade was steady on the trail in the way that good men are steady. Patient with the cattle, fair with the hands, decisive about problems without being rigid, with a dry humor about discomfort that Josie found increasingly endearing. He watched out for his hands, and also, in a way that was careful and not overbearing, for her. Knowing where she was, making sure the most experienced hand was positioned to help if needed, saying nothing about any of it, but doing it. She matched him every step, and she could see that this mattered to him. Not because he doubted her competence, but because watching her work was a pleasure he was allowing himself to have. She caught him watching her sometimes with that expression she had first seen at the Doyle gathering. Not quite what comes before amusement, but something more serious, more settled. At Bozeman, they got an excellent price, better than either had gotten the previous year, and the combined transport savings were exactly what Wade had calculated. They celebrated with dinner at the hotel restaurant, the only restaurant in town, sitting across a white-clothed table in their best trail clothes, with beef and potatoes, and a bottle of wine that was not exceptional, but was genuinely wine. They were both slightly light with exhaustion and accomplishment and the pleasure of each other's company. He held her hand across the table, which was not something men and women did in public in 1883 Montana Territory without making a statement about their intentions. She looked at their joined hands on the white tablecloth, then up at him. "People will talk," she said. "Let them," he said, which was so different from the man who had retreated into solitude 7 years before that she felt the change of it move through her like warm water. They rode home to Millbrook in October, under the first cold skies of autumn, the money from the drive in their saddlebags, and their hands settled into the easy rhythms of people who have stopped pretending to be less than they are to each other. And the whole territory did, in fact, talk about them, which they bore with patience and a certain shared amusement. Margaret Doyle, to her considerable credit, took personal satisfaction in the situation that she made no effort to disguise, and told anyone who would listen that she had seen it coming from the spring gathering. It was a Sunday in the first week of November, with the first real snow of the season coming down in thick, soft curtains that turned the world white and silent, when Wade Coleman asked Josie Hartwell to marry him. He had, she later learned, been planning it for 6 weeks. He had ridden into Bozeman in October, which she had thought was a supply run, and had spent a considerable amount of time with the one jeweler in town, a meticulous German immigrant named Otto Kraus, who took his craft seriously, and who had made, according to his own subsequent account, 3 different settings before Wade was satisfied. But on that Sunday morning in November, he simply appeared at her door in the early quiet of the snowfall with Rex the cattle dog at his heel, because Rex had apparently decided to come along, and he had the ring in his coat pocket, and he did not make a production of it. He came in and sat at her kitchen table, and she put coffee on, and they sat together in the warm lamplight, with the snow falling outside, and he reached into his pocket and set the ring on the table between them. It was a simple gold band, with a single dark red stone. A garnet, she would learn, because he had looked at the blue sapphires and the white diamonds, and had looked at the garnet and thought of her hair, which was exactly what he told her when she asked later. "Josie," he said, and his voice was the steady, low voice she loved, the voice that did not waste itself on unnecessary words. "I was a man who had decided not to want things. You rode onto my land in April to argue about cattle, and you entirely disarranged that decision. I want to marry you. I want to build a life here on this land with you. I want." He stopped briefly. "I want the whole of it, if you'll have me." She looked at the ring on the table, at the man across from it, at the snow falling in the window, at this whole extraordinary, ordinary morning. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will have you." She picked up the ring herself and put it on her own finger, which made him laugh. A real laugh, the open kind she had come to treasure. And she stood and came around the table to him, and he stood and took her face in both hands and kissed her for the first time. A long, certain, honest kiss, with the snow falling and the coffee on, and Rex asleep by the door. The whole territory knew by Tuesday. They were married in the spring of 1884 on a Saturday in late April, almost exactly a year to the day from the morning she had ridden onto his land about the fence. Margaret Doyle organized a celebration with the same military efficiency she brought to the spring gathering, and it was held outdoors at the Bar C because the day was brilliant and warm, with a sky of that infinite Montana blue. The Hartwell and Bar C hands stood together along the fence in their best clothes, and Pete cried quietly and denied it with complete conviction when anyone mentioned it. The ceremony was performed by Judge Amos Whitmore from Bozeman, a compact, serious man who had seen enough of the territory to know when something was real, and who delivered the words with a brevity and sincerity that suited both of them. Wade said his vows in the steady, low voice she loved, and he meant every word with the entirety of himself. She said hers clearly and without hesitation, meaning them with the same complete intent. When it was done, and they were standing together in the April sunshine, with the whole assembled community of Millbrook County around them, Wade turned to her with that contained smile, the one she had been collecting since the first time she saw it, on the day she had come to argue about cattle. She thought she had never in her life seen anyone look at her the way he was looking at her, with that complete and unguarded warmth. "Hello, Mrs. Coleman," he said. "Hello, Mr. Coleman," she said, and everyone cheered. The question of the 2 ranches was resolved practically the way they resolved most things. They kept both properties. The fence on the shared boundary was replaced entirely that spring, paid for jointly, and built to last with new posts and good wire running straight and true from the river crossing to the northern ridge. The Hartwell spread kept its name and its identity as a ranch, continuing to run under that name out of respect for Samuel Hartwell and the generations before him who had worked that land. Josie kept the Hartwell books, and Wade kept the Bar C books, and once a month they sat together at the big kitchen table in the Bar C house with both sets of ledgers and made decisions together about both operations, which worked with an efficiency that surprised their neighbors and not at all themselves. They moved into the Bar C house together, which was larger and had more room for what was to come. The Hartwell house Pete and Duke moved into, which meant the two hands who had worked the Hartwell land their whole careers stayed on it. Pete, in particular, was visibly relieved by the continuity. He had been part of that land since before Josie was born, and the idea of it being absorbed into something larger and losing its character had been a quiet worry he had carried all through the spring and into the wedding. "It keeps its name," Josie told him the week after the wedding, standing in the kitchen garden her father had planted. "It keeps everything. I'm not letting anything go." Pete nodded, and his expression was such that she pretended she had not seen it for his dignity. The summer of 1884 was the best summer either of them had known in years. Not because things were easy. Things in the territory were rarely easy, and the summer brought a late dry stretch that required careful management of their water resources and an outbreak of bloat in Wade's eastern herd that cost him 8 head before they contained it. But difficult things are fundamentally different when you are not carrying them alone. Josie had been carrying the Hartwell spread alone for 3 years, and Wade had been carrying the Bar C alone for 5 years before that, and the discovery that there was someone beside you who understood the weight of it and could help carry it, not out of obligation, but out of love and genuine partnership, was something neither of them had the words for, but both of them felt in every day. In the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the sky change and talked about the day, about the cattle, the water, the books they were reading, the territory and its politics, the news from the East that came in the papers 4 days late and was always surprising in ways that made them feel both connected to and distant from the world beyond the Montana hills. He had started telling her about his days in the small, specific way of someone who has not had a person to tell who has rediscovered the pleasure of it and is careful about it like someone who has found that a locked room opens after all and enters it gently. She told him about hers with the frankness and detail of someone who had always thought out loud but had not had the right listener. He was the right listener. He listened with his whole attention, the way he did everything, completely without half measures. Sometimes they argued. Not often, but genuinely about real things. About a decision regarding the county's water rights petition. About the best way to handle a disagreement with a buyer in Bozeman who had come up short on a payment. They argued with the clean directness of two people who respect each other's intelligence and do not use softness as a substitute for honesty, and the arguments resolved into agreements that were always better than either position they had started from, which Josie thought was the mark of an argument worth having. By October of 1884, she knew she was carrying their child. She told Wade on a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of October, after dinner on the porch in the last of the autumn warmth. She told him simply directly the way she told him everything, without preamble and without decoration. He was quiet for a moment, long enough to make her look at him. His face had done something she had not quite seen before. It was open in a way that was almost painful to look at. A depth of feeling that the controlled, reserved man he was had not prepared his face for showing, and he was not trying to hide it. He reached out and took her hand with both of his and held it. "Josie," he said, just her name in the low voice. "I know," she said. He pulled her toward him, and she leaned against him on the porch bench, his arms around her. The autumn sky going dark above the hills, the land spreading away in every direction. Their land. 2 properties made into one life. "I had stopped imagining this," he said quietly into her hair. "I had stopped imagining any of it." "I know," she said again. "Thank you," he said, "for riding over to argue about the cattle." She laughed, surprised, the real laugh, the involuntary one. She felt him smile against her hair. "You're welcome," she said. Their son was born in June of 1885 in the good bedroom of the Barcy house, attended by Dr. Foster from Millbrook and by Margaret Doyle, who had appointed herself the essential support for the occasion and could not be dissuaded, and in fact was genuinely useful. He was born on a Thursday morning when the summer was just settling into its long warmth, with a sky full of white clouds moving slow and great over the Montana hills, and he came into the world with a strong voice and dark hair, and what Dr. Foster assured them were the standard-issue gray eyes of a newborn that would likely clarify over time. They named him Samuel Elias Coleman for both grandfathers, which seemed right. Wade held his son for the first time in the afternoon of that Thursday, sitting in the good chair in the main room with the afternoon light coming through the windows, and Josie watched him from the doorway. Watched this man, who had been a closed and solitary figure for 7 years, who had been certain the life of a family was not for him, who had been wrong with a completeness that history would not let him forget, hold his son with a care and a wonder that was entirely unguarded, entirely real. Samuel, for his part, regarded his father with the blurry, serious attention of a new person who has a great deal to assess. "He's looking at you like he's already forming opinions," Josie said from the doorway. "That's your influence," Wade said without looking up. She crossed the room and sat on the arm of the chair and looked at the two of them, her husband and her son, in the summer afternoon light, and felt a happiness so solid and so complete it seemed almost architectural, something you could stand on and trust. Pete came to see the baby on Friday and held him with enormous care and told him seriously that the Hartwell land was going to be his someday too, which made Josie's eyes sting in a way she managed with reasonable dignity. Duke, who was 25 and had recently been conducting a careful correspondence with a young woman in Helena, held the baby with the expression of someone calculating something about his own future. Otis made a celebration dinner that was extraordinary and pretended he hadn't put any particular effort into it. Life on the Barcy and the Hartwell spread moved forward the way lives do, not in great dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of days, each carrying its own particular weather and its own particular work and its own particular pleasures. The cattle were driven to Bozeman every fall, and the prices moved up and down with the caprices of the market, and the weather came hard some winters and easy others, and the river rose and fell with the snowpack in the mountains to the west. Wade Coleman, who had not spoken a kind word to any woman in 7 years, and whom the whole territory had agreed would never marry, became a man that people in Millbrook pointed to as an example of something, though they were not always certain what exactly. Whether it was the possibility of change, or the reliability of the right person coming along at the right time, or simply the value of a well-maintained fence dispute. He remained himself reserved, economical with words, unlikely to wear his heart on the outside of his chest where anyone passing could see it. But those who knew him, who had known him before and knew him after, understood clearly that something fundamental had changed. The man who had been enclosed had opened. The man who had decided not to want things wanted everything now, and had it, and knew he had it, and carried that knowledge with him through every day of his life. In 1886, their daughter was born. They named her Grace not for anyone in particular, but because it was a name they had both liked from the first time they said it aloud, and because it suited a child who arrived, as Josie put it, already certain of her own opinions. She came in March, during a late snowstorm that had Dr. Foster arriving at the house with snow on his hat and his horse blowing steam, and she was from her first moments a person of considerable energy. "She's exactly like you," Wade said to Josie the evening after Grace was born, with Samuel sitting on the floor trying to eat a biscuit, and the baby in the cradle, and the March snow still coming down outside. "Is that a complaint?" Josie asked. "It is emphatically not a complaint," Wade said. Samuel from the floor offered an opinion in the form of a sound that was not quite a word yet, but clearly absorbed his father's habit of saying things that meant more than their surface. By 1887, the Bar C had expanded its herd by 300 head, and the Hartwell spread had established a reputation for quality breeding stock that brought buyers from as far as Colorado. Duke had married his Helena correspondent, a capable and warm-natured woman named Ellen, who moved to the ranch with her sewing box and her practical approach to life, and became in fairly short order an essential part of the Hartwell operation and a genuine friend to Josie. Pete had been coaxed by Ellen into eating properly for the first time in years and had the look of a man who had been significantly improved without being entirely aware of it. That fall, Wade and Josie rode together to Bozeman for the cattle market, as they did every fall. The same drive, the same route, the now comfortable logistics of two ranches operating as one. On the way back, on an October afternoon, with the aspens golden on the hillsides and the sky that clear, deep blue of autumn in Montana, they rode side by side in a comfortable quiet that had long since become one of their preferred modes of communication. "You know what I was thinking about today?" Wade said. "Tell me," she said. "I was thinking about that April morning," he said. "The first one, when you came over the ridge." She looked at him in the afternoon light, her husband of 3 years, the father of her children, the man who had been the territory's confirmed bachelor and had needed a fence dispute to remind him he was wrong. "What were you thinking about it?" she said. "I was thinking I didn't know what was about to happen," he said. "I saw you coming over the ridge on that bay mare and I thought, here is someone coming to make trouble. And I was right. But the trouble turned out to be the best thing that ever came onto my land." She rode beside him a moment, the October light warm on them both. "You made it easy," she said. "Eventually," he said. "I made it extremely difficult." "You were honest," she said. "That's worth more than easy." He looked at her sideways, in that way he had. The steady, direct look from those silver-gray eyes, and she felt it, the way she had felt it every time since that first April morning. Complete attention, directed at her, seeing her. "I love you," he said, exactly as he had said it the first time, simply, directly, with no decoration. "I love you," she said. They rode home together through the golden October afternoon toward the Bar C, toward Samuel and Grace and Otis's cooking, and Pete on the porch and all of it. The whole built life, the accumulated ordinary, extraordinary days. The land was all around them. Two properties become one life. The river crossing, with its rip-wrapped bank holding steady against the current. The fence running straight and true along the shared boundary between what had been two separate things and was now in every way that mattered, one. The whole territory had known Wade Coleman would never marry. The whole territory, it turned out, had not counted on Josie Hartwell and her fence dispute. The years moved through their seasons. 1888, 1889. The year Montana became a state, which Wade and Josie observed with a pride in the territory that was specific and earned. And with the years came the steady additions of a life built well. Samuel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's directness, who was on a horse by the time he was 4, and asking questions about cattle prices by the time he was 7, and who had Pete's absolute devotion, Otis's special biscuits, and a generally firm sense that the world was a place he belonged in. Grace was everything Wade had predicted, opinionated, energetic, affectionate in sudden, overwhelming bursts she delivered with the efficiency of someone accomplishing a task. She had Josie's red hair, and Wade's measured gaze, and a voice that carried impressively across the ranch yard when she had something to say, which was frequently. A third child came in 1891, another son, whom they named Henry, for no particular reason beyond that it was a name they both liked, and no one in the family had held before. A small new beginning for a small new person. Henry had Josie's brown eyes and Wade's dark hair, and from his earliest months, the equable, amiable temperament of someone who had been born into abundance and knew it. Comfortable in the world, in the deep settled way of a person whose whole life had already told him he belonged. By 1893, the Bar C was one of the most respected cattle operations in Montana. The Hartwell name still lived on its 1,000 acres, still ran breeding stock, buyers sought specifically, still had Pete on the porch in the evenings, though Pete's hair was entirely white now, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of a man in his 60s who had worked hard all his life and had earned the right to be slow about things. Josie sat on the Bar C porch on an evening in September of that year, watching the sun go down behind the western hills in a blaze of orange and red that would have made a painter set down his brush in frustration. Samuel was 8 and in the barn doing the evening feeding with Duke. Grace was 7 and had recently concluded she was going to learn to rope as well as Samuel, and had been practicing on fence posts with a dedication that had already cost 3 fence posts their dignity. Henry was 2 and asleep in the house, which was the primary reason the porch was quiet. Wade came out of the house and sat beside her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one, and they sat in the habitual comfortable quiet and watched the sky perform its September evening work. 10 years ago, Josie said, this property was 2 strangers' land. You were not a stranger by April, Wade said. We'd met in town. We'd exchanged polite nothings at the land office, Josie said. That's not meeting. Fair, he said. 10 years ago this spring, she said. I can barely remember what it felt like not knowing you. He was quiet a moment, the cup warm in his hands, the evening light turning everything amber and gold. I remember what it felt like, he said. She looked at him. Empty, he said. It felt empty. I convinced myself empty was acceptable. He looked at her. It isn't acceptable. I was simply not in a position to know that yet. She took his hand. Well, she said, you know now. I know now, he said. Rex, the original Rex, had been gone 2 years, replaced by a young cattle dog named Scout, who was learning the work with serious application. Scout was currently lying at Wade's feet with his head on his paws, managing the sunset with the philosophical composure of a working dog at rest. Samuel appeared from the barn direction and came across the yard with the gate-swinging stride of an 8-year-old boy who has finished his work and knows it. He came up the porch steps, leaned against the railing, and looked at the sunset with the same expression his father used on landscapes he found worthy of attention. Otis says supper's almost ready, Samuel reported. Tell him 5 minutes, Josie said. Samuel relayed this to the house with a holler that startled Scout and woke Henry, which set off a brief domestic sequence that resolved itself with Henry appearing at the porch door, held by Grace, who had apparently gotten him up in the name of keeping him company, and now looked slightly uncertain about this decision. He was crying, Grace reported. Bring him out, Josie said. Grace carried her little brother out onto the porch with the earnest, slightly over-careful manner she used when she was doing something she considered serious, and Wade took Henry from her and settled him against his shoulder. Henry, who was 2, and precisely where he wanted to be, immediately grabbed a handful of Wade's shirt and put his face against his father's neck with the complete confidence of someone who has always known exactly where he belongs. Wade's expression was the expression she had never stopped collecting. The full, open warmth of a man who had decided not to want things and had been entirely and gladly overruled. The sun finished its descent behind the western hills and left the sky a deep, clear purple blue above the land. The lights from the house came through the porch windows in warm yellow bars. The whole family was on the porch together, all of them. This thing that had been built from a fence dispute and a stubbornly reasonable woman on a bay mare, and a man who had finally, at the right moment with the right person, let himself be argued into something better than solitude. Come on, Josie said, standing with her coffee cup. Let's go into supper. Wade stood with Henry still against his shoulder, and Samuel held the door, and Grace went in first, talking about roping, and Scout followed everyone in with the assurance of a dog who has never doubted his welcome. The land lay quiet outside, the Yellowstone reflecting the last of the sky's light, the fence running straight and true along the shared boundary, the north meadow resting easy in the September dusk, everything held and tended and real. And inside the Bar C house the lamps were lit, and the table was set, and supper was ready, and the family of Wade and Josie Coleman gathered together in the warm light at the end of a Montana September day. And the whole territory knew, though they said it differently, now said it with the warmth and certainty of a story that had ended exactly right, that Wade Coleman had been, in the finest possible way, completely and entirely wrong about himself. The fence was repaired, the cattle stayed where they belonged, the land was held and loved and passed forward, and Josie Hartwell, who had ridden onto her neighbor's land on a spring morning to argue about cattle, and stayed to change his life entirely, sat at the head of her table, with her husband and her children, and the hands who were her family, in the lamplight that made everything warm. And she was home in every sense the word had ever contained. It was enough. It was everything. End of story.